You ever hear a man laugh at something he doesn't understand? There's a special kind of sound to it, a mix of confidence and ignorance, pride and blind spots. That's how many Japanese pilots reacted the first time they heard whispers about a new American carrier fighter, something called the F6F Hellcat. They'd spent years dancing circles around anything the United States threw into the sky. They believed their Zero was untouchable, almost mystical. So when they saw early photos of this bulky, wide-winged American beast, they chuckled. Some said it looked like a fat duck. Others joked it would probably fall off the carrier deck before it ever fought anyone. They'd been kings of the Pacific since December 1941, and kings tend to believe their own legends. But legends don't last forever. And if you listen closely to the old pilots who lived through it, you can almost hear the moment the laughter stopped. Before we jump into this story, let me take a quick breath and ask you for something simple. If you love history, real history told in a way that speaks to you like a friend around a warm fire, hit the subscribe button, tap that like, and share this video with anyone who enjoys learning about the people and machines that shaped our world. It helps more than you know, and I'm grateful for it. Now let's drift back into the Pacific sky, because that's where this tale really comes alive. Picture a Japanese naval aviator in early 1942, maybe 22, maybe 25, standing on the deck of a carrier like Shikaku or Zuikaku. The sea stretches out forever, blue and silent. He pulls his goggles down and climbs into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, the pride of the Imperial Navy. That aircraft was unlike anything America had in the air at the time. It's agile, frighteningly light, and armed with enough firepower to shred early U.S. fighters to pieces, the Zero was a shark among minnows. When those men throttled forward and lifted into the sky, they believed they owned the heavens. And in those early months, they weren't wrong. The American Wildcats struggled. Dive bombers and torpedo planes suffered terrible losses. Pilots wrote in their diaries about how the Zero climbed like a bird of prey and turned with the grace of a dancer. One described fighting it as trying to punch smoke. The U.S. Navy knew something had to change. The war would not be won with courage alone. They needed a new fighter, one designed specifically to beat the Zero where it was strong and punish it where it was weak. So let's shift scenes for a moment, far from the noise of carrier decks. We're now in a quiet office in Connecticut, early 1942. A man named Leroy Grumman sits at his drafting table. He isn't a pilot anymore, not like he used to be, but in his heart, the sky never left him. He spent nights thinking about the reports coming back from the Pacific. He studied every scrap of intelligence on the Zero he could get his hands on. He knew the Zero could turn tighter than anything America had. Fine, so don't fight it that way. Beat it somewhere else. Build something stronger, tougher, with claws instead of feathers. One night, as the story goes, he watched a colleague try to describe a new landing gear mechanism using a paperclip and an eraser. That strange little moment sparked the idea for the Hellcat's landing gear, sturdy, reliable, and perfect for carrier landings. But the rest of the aircraft, that came from something deeper. American engineers realized they didn't need another dancer. They needed a brawler, something that could take a hit, stay in the fight, and punch harder than the Zero ever could. So the Hellcat took shape. Thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, a powerful Pratt & Whitney engine ready to roar its way through the Pacific. It rolled off the assembly lines looking nothing like its Japanese rival. It was heavier, fatter, uglier in a way, but it carried a quiet truth in every rivet. Sometimes survival matters more than elegance. Now back on the other side of the ocean, Japanese pilots looked at the first photos of this new American machine and shrugged. It looked slow, it looked clumsy, and to pilots raised in a culture that prized maneuverability, grace, and the spiritual purity of air combat, the Hellcat seemed almost childish. A brute built by a nation that didn't understand real dogfighting. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know how many hours U.S. engineers spent studying not just aircraft diagrams, but captured diaries from Japanese pilots. They didn't know America was building a plane for the long war they weren't prepared to fight. They didn't know the Hellcat was being built not just to fly, but to win. The first time a Hellcat pilot met a Zero in real combat, something interesting happened. It wasn't a dramatic sudden shift. History rarely works in perfect snapshots, but those who were there said the air felt different. American pilots climbed faster, dove faster, survived hits that would have killed them a year earlier. They began using new tactics, energy fighting, boom and zoom, hit and run. They refused to turn with the Zeros, because why play the other man's game when you can write the rules yourself? There's an account from a pilot named James Flatley, one of the early tacticians who studied exactly how to beat the Zero. He told new Hellcat pilots something simple: never turn, use your speed, use your dive, use your engine. Hit them when they least expect it, and don't stay long enough to give them a second chance. Some didn't believe him at first. Many had grown up with different ideas of aerial dueling. But as the months slid by, Flatley's advice proved itself again and again. And then slowly, the laughter from the Japanese side began to fade. It wasn't just the aircraft, it was the pilots. American training changed dramatically in 1942 and 1943. No more rushed programs. No more underestimating the enemy. Every new pilot stepping into a Hellcat had logged hours upon hours learning how Zeros fought, how they moved, how they lived and died in the air. Those Japanese veterans who once felt invincible soon found themselves facing a new generation of disciplined, calm, well-trained opponents who didn't play by the old rules. The Pacific began to turn, not in a single battle and not in a single day, but in the quiet, relentless grind of attrition. The Japanese Naval Air Service, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, couldn't replace its best pilots fast enough. Every man lost was a man with years of experience, and every replacement was a young recruit trained in a hurry, often with minimal flight hours. Meanwhile, American carriers were arriving with more Hellcats, more pilots, more spare parts, more everything. War is cruel in many ways, but one of the cruelest truths is that quantity becomes quality after enough time. By late 1943, whispers started drifting into the Japanese ranks. Reports of new American fighters that climbed like devils and dived like stones. Pilots who survived long enough to land described dogfights where the enemy didn't turn at all, just struck from above, hit hard, then vanished into the clouds. Some commanders dismissed these stories. Others didn't want to believe them. But a few, especially those who'd survived the maelstrom around the Solomons, wrote in private that something was changing, and it wasn't in Japan's favor. Let me pause here for a moment, not to break the story, but to thank you for sticking with me through these early chapters. If you're enjoying this journey through the skies of the Pacific, consider sharing this video with someone who loves aviation history or WWII stories. It helps the channel grow and keeps these forgotten voices alive. Now, let's glide back into the cockpit. So now imagine the Pacific in 1943, a tangle of islands, coral atolls, and endless blue seas. The Americans were learning every day, adjusting tactics, swapping stories in debriefs, refining everything about how the Hellcat should be flown. The Japanese, on the other hand, were starting to feel a chill in the air, a sense that the skies were no longer theirs to command unchallenged. They didn't see it all at once, of course. No battle ends that way, but small hints kept piling up. A Zero lost to a Hellcat dive before it could react. Another squadron pinned down because the Americans coordinated attacks with radio chatter, flanking where the Japanese least expected. Slowly, the laughter faded. Confusion replaced it. And then, finally, fear. The turning point came in air battles around the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal, Bougainville, the skirmishes that had defined the early Pacific War, they were learning grounds. Hellcats weren't just surviving, they were dominating. Pilots like Gabby Gabreski and John Jimmy Thatch were becoming legends, not because they were braver than the Zeros, but because they understood the dance. They knew when to climb, when to dive, when to fire, and when to let the enemy fall into their trap. And all the while, the Zeros that once seemed untouchable found themselves being cut down by something they hadn't laughed at yet. And even then, the shock set in. They didn't know how to fight this new machine. Their own training hadn't prepared them for an enemy that could hit them from above, below, and the side, all without giving them a clear target to shoot back at. One story that survives from that period comes from a Japanese ace named Saburo Sakai. He had fought from the earliest days of the war, climbing into the sky over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over Midway. He had faced Wildcats, F4Fs, and a variety of American aircraft. But he wrote later, almost in disbelief, that the first time he faced a Hellcat, the plane seemed unremarkable at first, fat, slow, and cumbersome. As he laughed at it, told himself he didn't need to worry. But then, in a blink, it appeared above him in a dive, bullets tearing through the air, and he realized he underestimated it. The Hellcat didn't just survive, it struck, and then it vanished, as if mocking him back. For the first time, Sakai understood that the Americans had engineered a predator he hadn't seen coming. And it wasn't luck. The Hellcat's performance came from a combination of clever engineering, meticulous training, and lessons painfully learned from earlier defeats. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine gave it power unmatched by almost every other carrier fighter in the Pacific. Its armor protected the pilot in ways the fragile Zero could never dream of. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant that bullets that would have ignited a Japanese plane barely slowed the American bird. And while the Zero could twist and turn like a dancer, the Hellcat could climb faster, dive harder, and outgun almost every opponent it met. Speed, firepower, and durability, the three pillars the Americans leaned on, and they leaned on them well. There's a remarkable account from a pilot named Bill Spiv Spivey. He was flying cover for a strike group in late 1943 when a dozen Zeros came screaming down from above. Most American pilots would have panicked. Spivey didn't. He pushed his Hellcat into a steep climb, then banked into a dive, firing into the lead Zero. 2 seconds later, another followed. He turned again. And just like that, 3 Zeros fell out of the sky in flames, their pilots helpless, unable to comprehend what had hit them. Spivey landed that day, exhausted but alive, and all he could think about was how the plane had done the work for him. He trusted the machine because it had been built for survival, and in return, it had given him the chance to fight another day. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy tried to respond. They threw in newer Zeros, they tweaked engines, they trained replacements faster. But it was like trying to patch a dam after the water has already surged through. The American pilots weren't just flying aircraft. They were using tactics shaped by hard lessons, by study of enemy weaknesses, by coordination with other squadrons, by understanding what the Hellcat could do and what the Zero could not. And slowly, the numbers began to tell the story. Kill ratios that had once favored Japan flipped. Zeros began to fall at a rate never seen before. One after another, seasoned Japanese pilots were forced to retreat, crash, or abandon their planes. The machine they had once mocked was now their nemesis. There's a story from the Marianas Campaign in 1944 that illustrates this beautifully. A squadron of Hellcats was assigned to cover a group of torpedo bombers heading toward Saipan. They encountered a formation of Zeros planning to intercept. The Americans didn't engage the entire formation directly. They split, dove, climbed, and coordinated attacks in waves, communicating over radio, timing each pass perfectly. By the time the Zeros realized what was happening, half their number had already been shot down or driven away. The rest scattered. The Japanese pilots, who had once laughed at the sight of the Hellcat, later admitted they had been humiliated. And for the Americans, the victory wasn't just technical, it was psychological. They had proven that training, intelligence, and machine design could overcome the myth of invincibility. The turning tide shocked everyone who studied the Pacific War afterward. Historian Barrett Tillman, writing decades later, noted that the Hellcat was responsible for shooting down more Japanese aircraft than any other Allied fighter. Yet in many accounts, the human element is just as important as the machine. Pilots trained to exploit the Hellcat's strengths didn't just fly, they executed strategy midair, constantly thinking one step ahead. And they trusted their aircraft to survive hits that would have destroyed a Zero instantly. That trust, that confidence, made them deadly. And it all started with laughter that turned into disbelief and finally, fear. And here's the thing, these stories aren't just about tactics or numbers. They're about people. Young men, terrified, exhilarated, exhilaration tinged with grief, sitting in small metal cockpits, clutching controls, watching friends fall, realizing that survival depended not just on skill, but on understanding the capabilities of the machine beneath them. A few years earlier, those same pilots might have laughed at the idea of a clunky American fighter, and yet here they were, struggling to comprehend it in combat. They learned humility the hardest way possible, in the sky. Let me pause here for a quick breath. If you're following along, if the story of the Hellcat and the Pacific War is pulling you in, this is a great time to hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. It helps keep these incredible stories alive and gives us a chance to explore even deeper moments of courage and ingenuity from World War II. All right, let's keep soaring into the heart of the story. After that first wave of battles, Japanese pilots began studying the Hellcat, trying to understand what made it so effective. And that's when a crucial realization hit them. They were fighting a plane designed for the long haul, not just for dogfights. The Hellcat's durability meant pilots could take hits and stay in formation. Its firepower allowed for quick kills, making each engagement faster and more decisive. And its speed in dives let American pilots disengage when things got dangerous. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was immense. The Zero was no longer a guaranteed victor. The myth had been shattered, and the consequences were catastrophic. As the war rolled into 1944, the F6F Hellcat's dominance became clear in the Mariana and Palau Islands campaigns, and then in the Philippine Sea, a battle that would later earn the nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Thousands of Japanese aircraft took to the sky, confident in their skills and their machines. The Americans had their Hellcats in formation, escorting bombers, patrolling the skies, communicating constantly, coordinated like clockwork. The Zero's dove tried to turn, tried to fight, and were destroyed in overwhelming numbers. Pilots who had once mocked the Hellcat were now falling from the sky in flames, barely understanding how it had happened. By the end of that engagement, Japanese naval aviation was all but shattered. The days of easy victories and effortless control of the skies were gone, and it all traced back to that one plane, engineered with foresight, flown with discipline, and trusted implicitly by those who flew it. By the time the war reached its final year, the reputation of the F6F Hellcat had been cemented. Pilots in the Pacific knew it was more than just a plane, it was a turning point. The Japanese pilots who had once laughed, who had believed themselves untouchable, were now few, cautious, and constantly on edge. Every mission carried the weight of reality. The Hellcat didn't just survive, it struck with lethal precision, and it did so repeatedly. It had taken the best the Japanese Navy could throw at it and survived. More than that, it had rewritten the rules of the air war. Some of the old Japanese aces, those who had flown with pride over Pearl Harbor and early victories, wrote letters and diaries in the final months of the war. One of them described the first encounter with a Hellcat as a rude awakening, like a punch to the chest you never saw coming. Another admitted that the loss of experienced pilots to Hellcats was devastating, not only to morale, but to the very structure of their naval air units. They had been taught that the sky was theirs, that their skills and the Zero's agility could overcome any enemy, and suddenly none of that was true. The myth had died in the Pacific sunlight, replaced by a harsh, cold reality. The Hellcat existed, it was deadly, and it was American. These American pilots, of course, had their own stories. They weren't invincible either. Losses occurred every day, and survival depended on skill, timing, and a bit of luck. But there was a quiet confidence among them, a belief forged in training and combat alike. They trusted the Hellcat to give them a fighting chance, and more importantly, they trusted one another. A coordination in the air, the use of formation flying, covering angles, and constant communication over the radio allowed small groups of planes to accomplish feats that would have been impossible for a single pilot alone. In the chaos of aerial combat, it was this coordination that turned an aircraft into an instrument of dominance. There's one engagement that stands out, often cited in declassified reports, where a squadron of 12 Hellcats intercepted 28 Zeros attempting to attack a fleet near the Philippines. The Japanese formation assumed they had the advantage, counting on their superior maneuverability and the experience of their pilots. What they didn't know was that the Hellcats had precise intelligence on their flight paths, coordinated attacks planned, and trained pilots ready to exploit every opening. Within minutes, half the Zero formation was destroyed, and the rest scattered, beaten not by numbers, but by tactics, machine performance, and the quiet confidence of pilots who trusted their aircraft to deliver. The Japanese pilots who survived later admitted that the encounter had felt like fighting shadows, attacks coming from angles they didn't anticipate, strikes they couldn't predict, a machine that refused to fall even under punishment. It's fascinating to consider the human side of this, too. Every Hellcat pilot knew that the machine was remarkable, but survival still depended on courage, awareness, and camaraderie. They would recount stories of flying side by side with wingmen, watching for threats, signaling silently when ammo was low, when enemy aircraft approached from blind spots, or when a fellow pilot needed cover. In that air, amidst the roar of engines and the crackle of gunfire, these men found a rhythm, a trust that transcended fear. And in the Japanese ranks, that trust was gone, stripped away by losses, fatigue, and the inability to counter a plane that was superior in almost every measurable way. The contrast became painfully clear during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, hundreds of Japanese planes attempted to strike at the American fleet, confident in their ability to overwhelm. But the Hellcats were waiting. Intelligence had prepared the pilots. tactics had trained them, the aircraft itself was ready, and the results were staggering. Scores of zeros fell in minutes. Experienced pilots who had once been legends were suddenly reduced to statistics. Observers on the carriers described the scene as surreal. American fighters calmly attacking in waves, covering each other, communicating through the chaos, while Japanese formations crumbled like brittle paper under a storm. The laughter of the early war days was gone, replaced by shock and desperation. The reality was undeniable. The Hellcat was a machine born for survival, built for dominance, and flown by men who understood how to make the most of every advantage. Yet even in the midst of these battles, the story isn't one of machines alone. There's the human heart, the fear, the resolve, the small moments of humor and camaraderie that make these stories resonate across decades. Pilots wrote home about the intense focus, the adrenaline, the quiet relief of seeing a wingman cover a blind spot at the right moment. Some wrote about the strange satisfaction of a perfectly executed maneuver, of dodging death and gaining the upper hand through skill and timing. These moments, fleeting in the sky but vivid in memory, show that the war wasn't just about technology. It was about how humans interacted with machines, with each other, and with the relentless unpredictability of combat. And as the war moved toward its conclusion, Japanese naval aviation faced an unavoidable reckoning. The Hellcat was everywhere, its presence reshaping the skies from the Solomons to the Marianas, the Philippines, and beyond. The pilots who had once ruled the Pacific found themselves outmatched in ways they hadn't anticipated. Entire units were forced into defensive positions, retreating from territories they had once confidently controlled. The combination of pilot training, aircraft performance, and tactics turned the air into a new kind of battlefield, one where old legends of invincibility no longer applied. And through it all, the American Hellcat pilots continued to push forward, flying missions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, their confidence rooted in skill, trust, and the machine beneath them. By 1945, the F6F Hellcat had achieved a remarkable record. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, dozens of pilots decorated for extraordinary bravery, and the undeniable respect of both friend and foe. Japanese aces who had laughed at its appearance were forced to acknowledge, sometimes reluctantly, the role it had played in the tide of the war. And yet, as remarkable as the plane was, it was the people who flew it who made the difference. The design gave them the opportunity, the tactics taught them how to exploit it, but courage, trust, and human instinct were the final ingredients that turned the Hellcat into a legend. Let me pause again, because this is the part of the story that really resonates. If you've been following this tale of courage, engineering, and survival, take a moment now to subscribe, like, and share it. It ensures that more people get to hear these stories, that the voices of pilots long gone can still reach us, and that history continues to teach and inspire. Now, let's bring this story home. Even after the war ended, veterans of the Hellcat carried the memories of those flights with them. They spoke of the aircraft not just as a machine, but as a companion that had survived impossible odds alongside them. They recalled the terror and thrill of combat, the moments when life hung by a thread, and the quiet victories that came from coordination, skill, and trust in both man and machine. Many Japanese veterans, too, reflected on the shift in the Pacific skies, admitting in memoirs and interviews that the Hellcat had been unlike anything they had faced. It was not just the plane itself, but what it represented: a turning point, a new era of air warfare, a challenge to their assumptions, and ultimately, a force that changed the course of the conflict. And there's a profound lesson in this story, one that goes beyond aircraft or war. It's about resilience, adaptation, and the human spirit. The Hellcat didn't win by chance. It won because it was built thoughtfully, used wisely, and trusted implicitly. The pilots weren't perfect, but they learned, adapted, and worked together. And in doing so, they overcame an enemy who had once laughed at their approach, who underestimated their ingenuity, and who had relied too heavily on the past instead of preparing for the future. History remembers the machines, yes, but it's the people, their courage, their discipline, their camaraderie that truly shape the outcomes. As we reflect on these events, the story of the Hellcat and the Zeros becomes more than just a tale of technology or battle. It's a narrative about learning, about the dangers of underestimating others, about the power of preparation, and about how human ingenuity, when combined with the right tools and the right training, can turn the tide in even the darkest of times. And just as the dambusters of another theater relied on precision, courage, and daring innovation to achieve the impossible, so too did the Hellcat pilots carve their place in history, not just by shooting down enemy aircraft, but by embodying a spirit of resilience and mastery that resonates to this day. So as you imagine those skies over the Pacific, with Hellcats diving and climbing, engines roaring, and pilots focused on every movement of friend and foe alike, remember that the story isn't only about victory. It's about the moments that define people, the decisions made under pressure, the trust placed in one another, the lessons learned the hard way, and the courage that refuses to falter even when the odds seem impossible. That is the heartbeat of history. That is what the Hellcat truly represents, and in remembering it, we honor not just a machine, but the enduring human spirit that soared within it.